Welcome to Remaking the Economy, Redefining Leadership. I'm Steve Dubb, Senior Editor of Economic Justice here at Nonprofit Quarterly, coming to you from Boston on land historically stewarded by the Massachusetts Nation. MPQ's latest webinar in our Remaking the Economy series takes a deep dive into what are the kinds of leadership that the field needs to advance not only economic justice, but liberation. For this conversation, our panelists are Seema Agnani, Executive Director of the National Coalition for Asian Pacific American Community Development. Tony Pickett, CEO of Grounded Solutions Network. And Dr. Akilah Watkins, former CEO of the Center for Community Progress and soon to be CEO of Independent Sector. This conversation, I should add, takes place in a context. Namely, we are in a moment when people of color are taking the helm in what are historically white-led organizations, often, in times when more is demanded of leaders. So we want to look at strategies being used to address these challenges. This panel in particular grows out of two things. First, a discussion last spring by MPQ's Economic Justice Advisory Committee, which identified leadership as a priority topic to explore. And second, out of a conference held last spring by CEO Circle, an informal network of BIPOC community economic development leaders of color, including all three panelists here, that centered on this topic. I should add that Akilah, Tony, and Seema have each in their own way been leaders in the field of thinking through new models of liberatory leadership. A few notes. First, we're very excited to take your questions. We will start with our own and then get to yours, and we will leave significant time for questions. Please enter your questions into the question box at the bottom of your screen. I will share as many of them as I can. Second, we will share the slides and recording after the webinar, so no need to ask, will I get the slides and recording? You will. And they should go out probably the Monday after this webinar. I also encourage you to join the conversation via social media. We have the hashtag Rebuild the Economy, and please complete the survey after the webinar to inform our work. Lastly, I would also like to gratefully acknowledge that this webinar is sponsored by the investment firm Diamond Hill. To learn more about their investment products and their commitment to clients, visit their website, www.diamond-hill.com. And with that, I want to start with Tony. And Tony, if you can talk about what does liberation mean to you and what is required to get there?
Thank you, Steve. And yeah, I'm happy to kick it off. You know, I tend to think about and define liberation as thinking and acting without being constrained by the bias and the limitations that most often result from our shared legacy of racial oppression. I think about it in those terms, really creating and resourcing solutions that address the root causes of the issues that we're trying to address in society. Often that means envisioning bold ideas that match the scale and the urgency of what I believe and obviously are multi-generational problems that we're all dealing with, whether that's from economic opportunity to the impact of climate change, really incarceration in this country and the systems and the patterns that it reinforces. Really trying to throw off those limitations is what I think of when I'm thinking about liberation. It's no less than revising the systems and the structures that limit us as people of color from reaching our full potential as contributors to the society that we're part of.
Thanks, Akilah.
Yeah, I don't know if I have much to add on to Tony's very comprehensive response. You know, other than I think this is an important time for us to really embrace this term of liberation, because it's about how do we do things that are in the best interest of our community, right? How do we, in essence, have the power and freedom and control and resources to be able to execute things that truly help our most vulnerable parts of our community, right? And especially if we talk about leaders of color. And so we haven't traditionally had lots of opportunities to look at the full range of needs for our communities, right? And so I think that this term liberation becomes a very important one. It becomes an important one because of where we are in our conversations around race and justice, and how it's important for leaders like the ones on this phone call today, on this webinar today, to actually create spaces, right? And to participate in liberating activities, right? So I think, again, to surmise, liberation, is really about, it's an act, right? It's really how you do or have commitment to groups of individuals, especially those that have been historically oppressed. So.
Great, thanks. Seema?
Yeah, I think, as my colleagues have said, I think it's really when communities and individuals, families are able to live their best life without, the constraints that come from, everything from racism to capitalism to gender, misogyny, that really hold many of us back in our work life, in our daily lives. And so, it's what we're dreaming of, really, for each and every one of us. And in that way, we'd be able to all have a sense of belonging, community, and really, I think when we say healthy, thriving communities, it's what I imagine we're aiming for,
Thanks. Well, I wanted to throw this question to Tony about why is radical empathy so critical in this work? And of course, you wrote an article on radical empathy last year, so you can start there or wherever you want.
Yeah, Steve, I think, we have to start off by just, first of all, acknowledging that empathy is about feelings and emotions, and all of that is complex, and it really stems from your own personal experience and interactions, and really even comfort with expressing your emotions. And so when I wrote that article, I was going through a lot of different things, and I think I confided in Akila at the time, I feel like I'm sometimes challenged myself to be fully empathetic in terms of my interactions with people. And I'll just confess, I'm an only child, so it's sort of not necessarily automatic to me to really have a lot of emotional connection outside of my immediate family. So really thinking about empathy from that standpoint was kind of what I was writing about at the time. But also understanding and starting to really unpack what that means. We all understand that, there are different types of empathy. Even there's cognitive empathy, that you're just trying to understand the other person's perspective, really understand where they're coming from and put yourself in their shoes, as the saying goes. There's emotive empathy. It's you're feeling a similar emotion to the person that you're talking with or interacting with. If they're sad, you're feeling to some extent sad yourself because you understand the situation. There's also empathetic action, which goes beyond that understanding and sharing of feelings to actually move us to take action to help someone who's going through a situation. So I think, about the range of that. And I'm not one to say you should just be maximizing each of those types of empathy in every interaction. Again, it depends on the nature of your relationship and your understanding of the situation and your own sort of, I would say, for lack of a better term, bias sometimes in the situation based on your experiences. But all that to say, I think we're at a time, a critical moment in this nation when we really need to start asking ourselves, can we be empathetic towards those who don't necessarily have a family connection, who don't look like us, who don't live in exactly the same community with the same customs or are of the same race or ethnicity? And I believe that's possible. I know it is. And I think we really need to kind of start to talk about that and emphasize that to overcome some of the division that is going on. We're being, all of us, we know it as people of color, we're being othered in a lot of different ways in the conversations and the narratives that are being traded about the current context of the country and what we're going through. And it's not fair. It's not right. We all belong to one race, the human race, and all of the things that it takes for any member of the human race to be successful should be extended to every one of us equally. And we hadn't created, again, a system or even policies that easily allow a lot of that to happen. So I would say, my sort of big sort of push on empathy and radical empathy at that is to say, we're not empathetic enough as a culture in this country. It's somehow been turned into some kind of weakness or a deficiency if you're seen to be emotional and empathetic towards others that don't necessarily look like you, not the same gender as you, not the same race as you. And that's something that we need to change.
Thanks. Anyone else want to add to that, or should I move on?
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I would like to add to it, and I really deeply appreciate Tony taking the reins on this question, because we don't get to really talk about empathy a lot, and we don't get to hear a lot of men talk about empathy, which I think is extremely, extremely important. So I think one of the tenets of empathy is this whole idea of being seen and valued, right? And Tony talks about that explicitly. But I think for communities of color, the whole idea of empathy is to actually see people, right? And for communities that have been historically invisible, or they have just been extractive practices have just been used. So they've been othered, right? So empathy radical empathy sort of changes the relationship that we have with each other in this country. And and that's courageous to do that. It's courageous to see people. It's courageous to see people who have historically been invisible on purpose. And then it's also equally or even more important to say, I find value in you, right? That part. And we all know that when people are from from different backgrounds, communities, economic classes, races, that there may be some social distance there. And to say that even with the distance that we have, I still see value in you. That's powerful. It's a very, very powerful sentiment to say. It goes against a lot of the tides that we've all sort of had to endure in this country. And we're seeing some of it even play out in our current sort of, larger political system, because we should never lose sight of the point that we all have value, and that part of living in a society together is that we see that value and we value that value. So that's the only thing I want to add.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Seema, I think I'll pass it to you. Could you talk about what does collective leadership look like? And I know you wrote about this in MPQ as well, in your vision of leadership.
Yeah, I think, what we were really trying to speak to in that piece was really that, this idea of our fates are tied together, right? I mean, I think, for the Asian American community specifically, the last few years have really, impacted our communities in new and different ways, or maybe in more amplified ways, right? To this point of invisibility, I think, that's been an issue for many Asian American communities for a long time. And so we've been really asking ourselves, how do we move forward from this, and why are our communities not seen? And so, that's one perspective. And also this idea, I love this idea of radical empathy, because at the end of the day, we've been asking ourselves, how do you get people to care for one another again, right? Because as we've grown as a country, as we've become more racialized, that at the end of the day is really what's coming into question. And so shared leadership, meaning, we need to be working together in coalition across racial groups, in order to really get to what I think many of us are dreaming of in terms of, a multiracial society where everyone can live, in healthy, thriving communities. Not to overuse that language either. Sorry.
That's okay.
Steve, before you go on,
yeah.
something that sort of comes up for me in hearing Akilah and Seema talk, that C word, care, the sort of other end of the spectrum for me is capitalism. It's the competition of capitalism overshadows this emphasis on care. And we're simply going through this process, and because capitalism has been set as the framework, everyone is simply trying to live out whatever their component of the capitalist system is. And that's the thing that we've got to liberate ourselves from, is thinking that we have to implement capitalism the same way just because for the last several generations it's been one particular way. So I think we've got to start to kind of reimagine. Maybe it doesn't have to have a label, it just needs to be something beyond traditional capitalism.
Thanks, Tony. I think I actually want to ask this question from the audience because it sort of follows on what you just said. So I don't know if you want to add any more, but I'll just throw it in there because the question was, what makes empathy radical, and how is radical empathy different than the conventional understanding of the ideas? So I think you can sort of follow on what you're talking about, but anything you want to add?
Yeah, I just say, we've sort of left it to those of us in the charitable space to be empathetic, but we need folks who are in more traditional spaces, both in the political realm, in the economic realm, and other places throughout our systems to really center this idea of empathy, make it more than just about a compassionate response to an emergency or an urgent situation. We should be thinking about, again, if everyone doesn't have a decent, safe place to live, it's impossible to withstand a global pandemic. So why don't we start working toward that goal now before we wait for the next crisis situation and then scramble to try to support our own people?
And I also think what makes it radical, one is that to actually see and find value in people that don't have power in society is part of what makes it radical. I mean, we have empathy sometimes, for a lot of times, for folks where it's advantageous to have empathy for them. But what about connecting and seeing people and having empathy for people that haven't traditionally had power in society, right? And that it's unpopular. And you have to sort of untangle all of the systemic, traps, right? And so, people are indicted if we have to see certain other people. And then the second thing that makes it radical is that it's not empathy for empathy's sake, right? It's beautiful to tell somebody, I see you and I value you. It's even more valuable to do something about it, right? So like we all show up, trying to house the millions of Americans that don't have access to high quality housing. We're working in communities where we're trying to help people take more control of their land resources and reimagine how they can use land in service of their community. Like it's great to have words, but people are in dire circumstances and they need action.
Yeah, thanks. Well, I want to move on to our next question, which is, so this is the webinar is called Redefining Leadership. So what are some of the leading challenges in redefining leadership that you'd want? I mean, you've all had to come into organizations and lead organizations, and I know you faced plenty of challenges. So what would you say are some of the principal ones? And anybody can jump in.
Well, I mean, I think within organizations, there is, of course, unrealistic expectation of the CEO, executive director, so, the idea of shared leadership actually works very much to our benefit. The more you share, the easier it gets. So I think, that's a big challenge. And then back to what Tony was saying, like we're working within a flawed system, we're trying to implement models that don't fit into the structures we're working in. And so that is a huge challenge and requires us to create small areas of, society where we can test and pilot different models.
Yeah, I agree, Seema, and I think that unrealistic expectation extends to the time frame for even making progress. The expectation of us is somehow we're going to magically overcome, multiple decades of oppression and bias and just a wave of the hand with very few real resources. And I've been sort of harping on this for the last couple of years. The scale of the resources have to match the scale of the problem. And if you're going to try to hold us to some standard of, well, we're going to base your resources on the size of your organization's annual budget. Well, you want me to grow the organization, so why not give me the resources to allow me to do that, and not in this small incremental fashion, because the problem is so large and there are obstacles at every turn. So I think we have to really kind of push hard to say we need 10, 20-year support, not sort of 1, 2, 3, that's nice, but it's a long struggle. And I've sort of talked about this, it takes a lot of patience to kind of test an approach, to shift systems and shift mindsets and really start to show demonstrations of what a different kind of approach, a different world, even a different outcome can be for communities of color. And even sometimes, no matter what data proof that we have, people still don't embrace that as a solution. They still are doubtful when you're presenting data that shows them what success looks like. So we're still ourselves having to overcome, I would call it a resistance to leaders of color actually achieving success at a large scale. It's like we're being held to some incremental standard when, again, we should be free to create something that we, from our experience and coming from the communities that we come from, know is part of the answer to the situation.
Thanks. Akilah, anything you want to add?
No, not on this one.
Okay. Well, I'll move on to the next one then. This one, I suspect you will have things to say. Could you provide some tangible examples of what are new leadership practices that move organizations in more liberatory direction?
Yeah, I mean, I can start on this one. So I think there are a couple of different things. I think even about how we think about shared leadership or partnership. When we formed the CEO circle, and as we sort of developed it, one of the things that we did was we partnered around something as simple as space, right? This was pre-COVID, right? But did it make sense for all of us to have separate office spaces? Could we come together and partner around that? I think this is even more of a salient question right now in a post-COVID world where commercial property may not make as much sense to own it for the long term by yourself. So that's one way that organizations today can partner. The second way is combining or co-branding any sort of national event. Myself and Grounded Solutions, we did this. We were both having a conference in 2019. It didn't make, and we were going to be in the same city. Did it make sense for us to do two separate hotel contracts and that sort of stuff? It didn't. We actually co-branded our national conferences. And then we increased attendance to those conferences for both of us, right? So it was a win-win. It was cheaper. It made sense. Our goals were aligned. So that's another way organizations can do. Obviously, that's a big feat to do. So we do smaller things. We partner around webinar topics. We partner around things like this, articles together, programming, right? Are there any funding opportunities we could partner around? Any funder meetings, right? So I think that it makes sense for all, for me and Tony or me and SEMA to go to, right? Even if it means just supporting SEMA. That's the other thing we've done, I think, at a very high and successful level is we know how to support each other. And it doesn't necessarily have, sort of this direct impact, but we know it's important for the field and for the work. And we want to support each other in this space. So I think there are a lot of ways. I named some real tangible ways, but what I wanted to say theoretically is that there's several layers to partnership, right? There's sort of like the basic layer, where you sign on to each other's sort of, policy recommendations or letters of any sort of letters of recommendation. That's one level. And we do that for each other very, we do that for each other where it makes sense all the time. But then there's a second layer where you actually do programming together, right? And that's a deeper, more intense level. And choosing one or two programs to partner around, I would tell people 6 months to 12 months, just to see how the partnerships happen. And partnerships happen at various levels. So while Tony and I can develop a partnership, we also have to help our staffs manage so they can come together and they can help fulfill the partnership, because it's not just two people, it's two organizations with two different cultures, right? So, and then there's a deeper level under that. Then there's sort of strategic partnership, right? Like, who are those core organizational partners that you and them actually discuss sort of your organization, but sort of the whole ecosystem and the role you all want to play in that ecosystem, and how do you make it more amenable to your organization? That's a different level of strategy. And so I wanted to just sort of outline that partnership is not a dichotomy, but rather it's a spectrum. And to understand that where you are on the spectrum of organizational partnership differs on a lot of different things. And I'm more than happy to talk about those things if people have questions about it. But know that you don't have to have a strategic partnership. You can actually start out with a level 1 partnership. So I want to just give people that sort of option there.
Great. I don't know, Seema or Tony, anything you want to add on partnerships?
I mean, agree with everything Akila just said. I think the what I was sitting with is, how it plays out in local communities. I think again, the post-COVID, when our communities were struggling, it was really the long-term relationships that had been built over the years that became most impactful and helpful in times of crisis, right? So, just to lift up the point that, these things take time and they take trust building. And, then when, you're able to actually move together in times of crisis, that doesn't happen overnight. And that comes through long-term relationship building and trust building among organizations and leaders,
Yeah, I just want to add on, Akila was kind of describing all that, and it makes it sound like that we all just sort of gelled around like this blueprint. There was no blueprint. We were sort of trying to figure out like, well, what do we want this thing to be? How big do we want it to be? What do we want it to accomplish? And we were fortunate, we were blessed to have an amazing resource in Marcus Little's Frontline Solutions to help us work through this, so we didn't have to do it solely on our own. And that's another thing. There are organizations and folks out there that are POC led that can help build this kind of trust to really think about strategically how to be more collaborative, and rather than competitive, as I referred to earlier. We don't have to just figure all this out on our own.
Great. So I wanted to also ask about if there are tangible examples within organizations. So, different ways of doing procurement, different ways of doing personnel. I know when there was the conference I referred to in the beginning in Puerto Rico, that there was quite a few ideas that came out of that. So any specifics you want to give in that area?
I'll just say, Steve, for us at Grounded Solutions, we've gone through a multi-year journey in really better prioritizing racial equity within the organization. And it ranged from our interpersonal understanding of what the definition of racial equity is, to doing things like working with the board of directors to actually create a policy that starts to talk about our emphasis in procurement on working with consultants that are led by people of color, not just sort of looking at the outcomes and impact of the work itself, but how are we really creating opportunities for people of color to exercise leadership in a variety of ways in addressing the problem that we're trying to solve from a mission standpoint. So I would also say it was a very clear intent on our part, along with the board of directors, to create a more racially diverse board of directors. And, that has happened rather rapidly for the organization with great results and outcomes. And I just want to really thank Akila for taking on the role as our board chair throughout this process, and really being my thought partner in making that happen. So we're not sort of adhering to some of the more conventional ideas about what is the nature of a relationship. Yeah, Akila and I are both running nonprofit organizations. She's the chair of my board. We're in the CEO circle together. We raise money together. We throw events together. There's not this idea that somehow we have to limit our interaction because we have some other type of relationship. We're sensitive to that, but I would say we've been really successful thus far in moving the organization along this spectrum of wanting to have more emphasis on racial equity, and not only in the impact of the work, but in how the organization conducts the business itself.
Thanks. Akila, you want to jump in now?
I think Tony nailed it. The only thing, just from an organizational perspective, that we did about things like procurement, one is that we wanted to really be clear about what our racial equities sort of value system was as an organization, right? So I think it was important for us to do the necessary work internally with our staff, and I'm more than happy to talk about what some of that work was or is, because we know racial equity is not a destination, but it's a journey, it's a process. I think the second thing we did was we did a baseline of where we were spending money at and who we were spending money with as an organization. And we created some benchmarks around it. It takes some time to figure out, who you're spending money with, what the race of your vendors are. Like many organizations, I think we just had to become more conscious about it. And because we were clear around what our racial equity goals were, it made it just better for us to create some benchmarks we felt would push us, but also were appropriate for the working communities that we hold dear to us as an organization. So, and over the last few years, we've seen the number of vendors of color really increase, right? And because organizations in and of themselves, we spend a lot of money. We have, we make deep impacts to local economies. And so when you do go to a city and you are having a community meeting, can you hire the local vendor in the community, right? It may be a little bit more work, but can you do it? The other thing we had to do is be clear that certain things may cost a little bit more. Like you may need an additional insurance rider if you are, working with a local, let's say, childcare provider, because she doesn't have the sort of large insurances, so you can do a rider. Those are the type of things that, okay, take a little bit more work, but what they yield locally is so much more important. And I also think that's one thing we have to build into our budgets. We have to get our boards really socialized around this idea, is that it costs money to be equitable. And there are some things we can do and it doesn't cost money, but there are some things that will require additional time and resources. And we just need to socialize that idea and get ready as organizational leaders and organizations that when we do business, have we made this opportunity as competitive for businesses of color? And if we have, what can we do as an organization to help facilitate that? So again, I just wanted to sort of, and this is just some of the work that we've done as an organization. We take racial, at CCP, we take racial equity extremely, it's one of our deep value systems, but it also helped us do our work differently. And I think that that's important too.
Yeah, thanks. Seem anything you want to add?
I mean, I guess just the only thing I will add is, if you take that to your practices internally in terms of staff recruitment and development, the same things apply, right? You do need to, we've been trying to budget a lot more for professional development and building in support systems for staff as we also try to achieve equity goals in terms of, even within the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander community, there's so much diversity. For us, it also means, how do we bring in more Pacific Islanders into our organization? What are the additional investments we need to make to support folks from those communities to be able to engage in our work more effectively, so.
Great. So one other question I was going to ask you guys is about how do you invest in leadership? And you can think of that, I think, in two different ways, like developing leaders within organizations or within the community. So because you're working both, internally and externally. So how do you want to address that?
I mean, we always try to hire from the community where possible. We also, we're a coalition of members, so we try not to recruit staff from our member organizations, but sometimes when they leave, they come to us next, and that's a good outcome. But yeah, I think, in terms of succession planning, I think recruiting from the community, I like to think of it as succession planting, not planning, place your seeds all over and you will have more options in the long run as, you can never have too many leaders, as one of my mentors has always says, the leadership is the more you have, the better you are. So I think investing in leaders across the organization is really the best way to approach that.
The only thing I would add, and your question, Steve, is really about how do we support leadership. So I think one way to do that, especially at this level, at the executive level, one is having really good quality staff around you. I always I'm going to talk to leaders directly, like getting a really good executive assistant is going to just make your life so much better. We cannot do it alone as leaders. And especially when you're a leader of color, there's a layer of work that you just do that is invisible. And you do it because you know that this is a moment that we're having and you want that moment to be longer than a moment, right? So you want it to be a movement, right? And sometimes your presence just adds so much value to work, to communities. And so it is so important for the leaders of organizations to have really good, solid folks around them to help them maximize their time. So that is one of the first things I would say in terms of building executive level leadership. I think the second thing, and this is to Seema's point, is really around helping to create pipelines, right? I think one of the things we strive to do in the CEO circle is to create this pipeline for especially leaders of color, because historically they haven't had the same opportunities to show up and demonstrate their leadership abilities. And so what does it look like to create these pipelines, especially for younger professional, mid-career, that are interested in growing their leadership? And so we have been talking about this, and part of what the Puerto Rico convening was really about pulling BIPOC leaders of color so we could begin to identify what these challenges are, these impediments to leadership, and then begin to actually build out a suite of trainings or programs or case studies that can help both organizations and funders and leaders themselves be able to actually move through this pipeline more effortlessly. So those are just some of the things I like to add, but there's a lot more that goes into sort of creating optimal executive leadership. And I'm more than happy to talk more about those. I know I just mentioned one with having a really good assistant, but there are a lot of other things that go into it, mainly having really good organizational partners, like what we've been able to design here today. But I'm more than happy to talk more in depth, depending on the questions.
Okay, Tony, anything?
Yeah, I think I agree with everything that's been said. And there's also sort of this unspoken challenge that we're all kind of dealing with. There is a great deal of, I'll call it movement within the employment markets. And, expecting someone to be able to fulfill all of their potential within one organization, it's probably no longer possible. And you have to kind of prepare yourself for the fact that you can offer support, you can offer opportunities to advance, but if folks get offered a better opportunity outside of your organization that you're unable to match, it's not a failure. It is a success. You have prepared that person to go on to bigger and better. And that's what we need to kind of start to normalize, as opposed to it being perceived of as some kind of failure or some negative outcome to have some degree of turnover going on within the organization. I can tell you, no one I've talked to within the last year and a half has been able to withstand a large degree of turnover. It's simply you're going to have to adapt. Akil's point about creating pipelines, we're always having to think about, okay, where is the talent that we need to be recruiting, cultivating? If we can hire interns, if we can engage graduate research students, those are avenues that we're exploring. We're constantly interacting with those folks to really develop additional talent that we could eventually bring into the organization. I think one of the things that we're committed to doing as a CEO Circle next year is really delving much deeper into this talent pipeline issue and figuring out at least what's working in terms of where people are sourcing talent from, and what do we need to do to really institutionalize that, because right now it's sort of a luck of the draw opportunity that you run across people, and it's word of mouth and relationships that bring those people to the table. We need to have some more structure around that so that we can identify those folks early and start to create places for them.
Great, thanks. Want to get an audience question here. So this one, I'm going to try to shorten it a little bit. How does, this is a person who's a Black leader of an organization, and the person's asking, how does radical empathy plant seeds of disruption that foster the conditions that speed us up from interpersonal empathy to systemic radical empathy? And any examples that you might have left? So that might be for you, Tony, or anyone else.
Yeah, I'll just say, I think you posted the link to the article, and it's directly connected to the work that we do at Grounded Solutions. We're out talking about community land trusts and what their impact is beyond just housing people. We're actually building power and knowledge in the leaders of those community land trusts. A number of them have made the transition to elected positions within their local communities, and they're now interjecting their ideas and thoughts into the political discourse. So we look at this beyond just the fact that we're a housing organization. We're really trying to build power in communities to really affect their own destiny in a way that they have not traditionally been able to do.
Thanks. Let's see. This looks like a question for Akila, and I'll let you answer this how you want to. So I know you're not at IS yet, so they're asking about IS, but independent sector. But the question is, so you can think of this more broadly in terms of field infrastructure, though you don't have to answer for them. But given all the challenges and polarization and the positive effects and potential around diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging work, what is your vision for bridging differences and potentially partnering across sectors for better results for the people who need services most? Easy question.
That's a big question. No, but I think it's an important one, and I hope I'm gonna capture the spirit of your question. First of all, I don't have to solve every challenge or problem by myself. I think there are a lot of people that have been working on this. And so I think when I get to independent sector, I want to be able to lean on the collective genius of our field, because we've all been working on this whole idea of racial equity, right? What does it mean? How do we operationalize it in our respective organizations? So I that's going to be one of the first things that I do, is really listen and pull together, I think, thought leaders around this work to really help us sort of help me and help the field sort of understand the moment that we're in, how it's changed, and how do we support leaders of color moving forward, among other leaders. I think the second thing is that the work that we've done around the CEO circle has just been awe-inspiring for me, because, we came together 4 years ago, and it was only a handful of leaders of color at the time leading national organizations in community development. And I think one of the most powerful things we've done is be able to create a whole new paradigm of what leadership looks like. How do we experience leadership? What do successful leadership models look like? Like Tony said, when we started, we did not have that, like the way I talk about partnership and the various levels and the dichotomy, and we didn't have any of that. We were doing trust building. And so what I would love for us to be able to figure out what parts of the CEO circle have worked, and be able to modulate them in some ways, because there's a lot of folks in a lot of different sectors that are like, how do we build something like this? What do we need? How did you guys get started? And so we want to be able to answer those questions so we can work across fields, strengthen leaders, have important and critical conversations around equity. So I hope I answered your question directly. It's going to be a collective movement on how that question gets answered.
Great, thanks. So there's a couple questions from the audience on liberation, which seems appropriate. So one, and I'm just going to throw these out and see if you have any responses. So one is, where do all of you see the importance of global solidarity in the struggle for liberation? And another is about notes that racism is a key feature of capitalism by design. It's called racial capitalism, right? How can we remake the economy and have any type of liberation if this fundamental feature of the predatory capitalism system is not addressed first? So those are a couple questions, and you can take them in any direction you like.
I'll just start off. I'll say, we definitely see the need for global solidarity, as it's phrased there. And there's an actual international community land trust movement. Actually, they just celebrated World CLT Day, and they had folks from across the world who are all using some variation on the community land trust model, talking about how it looks in their context. What are they focused on? What are the priorities? What are they trying to achieve? I've participated in that in the past, along with members of my staff who are doing so this year. And one of the things I just want to note that I've sort of been very outspoken about, similar to this panel, is the contemplation of racial equity in the international context. And I will tell you, I kind of have seen folks talk about their housing work without really accounting for the race aspect of it. And doesn't matter pretty much what the culture is, where you are in the world, there's some aspect of that at play. And I've had to say at times, there was a global slave trade, and enslaved people were distributed all over the world, and all of the oppression and bias that went along with that got translated into those contexts along with the people. And so if you're not really paying attention to that, if you're not really looking at, well, are people who are of a darker hue in skin tone being discriminated against, and you're not really talking about that and confronting it, what are we really doing? So I think that's part of the conversation in that global context as well.
Great. Seema, do you want to jump in at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's absolutely necessary. And I think, if we want to work towards, shared understanding of one another's history, you have to think about it within the global context. So it's understanding the race. And, in some places, like in India, for example, it's also, there are issues of persecuted communities because of their faith. Gender comes into play quite a bit. And so, understanding the caste system in India, things like that, which really, of course, there are things that tie us all together. And, if we're really going to make progress within the US and beyond, there is a real need for us to understand each other's histories and where these sort of inequities really emerge from, so the slave trade, those same ships that were used, for the slave trade were later used to move indentured servants across the globe, and so our histories are tied together from a shared colonial history. And so it's important for all of us to have that understanding in this work.
Thanks, Seema. Let's see, I'm going to try to get this question in quickly because we're running short on time. We'll see how much I can get. But it was an interesting comment. So, because Tony, you talked a little bit earlier about, that it's not a failure, but a success when somebody goes on to another organization, but it does create a dynamic. This is what the questioner, where, an organization invests in leadership and they don't get rewarded. So it's a leadership challenge, right? Like, how should we be thinking about, this challenge of, with if turnover increases and is there a way for the field for the field of community economic development to be built, so that it's still beneficial to the organization that, loses the talented employee?
Yeah, well, Steve, one of the things I will say is I've seen this tendency to create a new organization because there's a new idea on the table, as opposed to allowing an existing organization to expand or supporting that expansion. So again, I think there's a question for us as a field is, well, what do we want to sort of consider as success for the field at large? Is it the number of organizations? Is it the impact the organizations are having? It's just like what we're talking about as an individual or organization. We have a network of nonprofit organizations, and we're constantly having a debate internally about, well, are we fostering new organizations and just putting them on this multi-year path to have to create sustainable organizations, or can we support an existing organization to serve the need in a particular community? So I would just say there's no clear answer to that question, but I think there's some thought to be given about defining what success might look like and starting to work toward that.
Great. Okay, well, we're basically at time. I'll give each of you maybe 20 seconds to share any last thoughts. I'll start with Akilah.
This is an exciting time for the field, but it's also a time we have a lot of work to do ahead of us. We're moving into economic uncertainty. We're going to need the collective genius of all of our leaders in this work, but we do have to support, especially our smaller and mid-sized organizations, our BIPOC ran organizations. They need the support. Our families need the support.
Seema?
Yeah, I think I'll just end, thank you for pushing us to think at a different level than the day-to-day. Steve, appreciate the opportunity. And, what I will say is, it's important to remember there is progress being made. And, I feel like we are at a really interesting time in history, and I see a lot of progress happening in this moment. And so I guess in the hopes of offering some hope, things are changing, and hopefully for the better. And it really does depend on us in this moment, I think.
Thanks. Tony, I'll give you the last word, I guess.
Yeah, I'll echo Seema. I see cause for optimism. I noted that there were many ballot initiatives that were focused, at least in our space, around housing, and a number of those were successful, and they are providing significant resources to start to, again, continue to address this housing crisis that we find ourselves in as a nation. I would say, again, it ties back to where we started, demonstrating that empathy, like we acknowledge the fact that we're in a housing crisis and we need to devote resources to it. And the vote needs to reflect that. And so the leaders that are being elected, if they're not talking about housing, they should be. I know there's a host of other issues on the table as well, but it's not insignificant in terms of communicating that we care about people's welfare to house them.
Great. Well, with that, I want to wrap up this webinar. Obviously, we could have continued for a lot longer, but we were joking. We were going to solve all the issues of redefining leadership in 2 hours either. So I really appreciate. I want to thank our panelists, Seema Ignani from National Capacity, Tony Pickett from Grounded Solutions Network, Keela Watkins from Center for Community Progress and Seeing Independent Sector. And I want to thank all of the amazing questions from the audience and your participation both through the questions in the chat. Thanks so much. We noted it in the chat. There is a virtual roundtable that's coming up at MPQ on November 16th. That's only 6 days. There'll be a special time at 4:30 p.m. instead of our normal 2 p.m. time. And it will be on bargaining for the common good. So that's based on an article series we published earlier this fall, and I encourage you to sign up for that. It's free, and the link is in the chat. Thanks so much to everyone again, and see you soon.
Thank you, Steve. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Steve.